This video is a preview of our course lesson. Please visit myconsultingcoach.com to access the full version. In this video, we will solve a McKinsey-style case concerning Caledonian Airways. The Caledonian Airways case initially looks like a standard profitability case, but it has a lot of nuances which standard frameworks are not equipped to deal with. The case is interviewer-led, meaning that the interviewer will guide the candidate through the case. This is the standard format adopted by McKinsey. This video will be structured following the 4 steps of our case-solving process, as described in the My Consulting Coach Academy. At each stage, we will first give you a chance to try out what you would do. Then, we will listen to a well-prepared candidate approaching the problem. After that, we will pause for a close examination of exactly what the candidate is doing. Throughout the video, we will signal where we are in this repeating sequence with one of the following 4 letters. I refers to interviewer speech. This means the interviewer is talking and that we should listen closely. Y means that it is your turn to try out your skills on the problem. C signals candidate speech. Our candidate will be taking a valid approach to the case. F indicates analysis. In these sections, we will be conducting a detailed analysis of that approach. We begin with the interviewer delivering the case prompt.
Our client is Caledonian Airways, CA, an airline based in Northern Europe. At the beginning of the decade, they showed several consecutive years of profitability. However, in the last 3 years, they have started turning a loss. CA's CEO called us last night asking us to advise her on what to do to turn the situation around.
Well, what would you do? You can take a moment now to think about how you would open the discussion. The first stage in the My Consulting Coach approach to problem solving is to identify precisely what the problem we are dealing with is. Our candidate makes their initial remarks.
Thank you for the opportunity to solve this problem. Before diving in, I'd like to ask a few questions to better understand Caledonian Airlines' business and then clarify the problem we're solving. Is that okay?
Yes.
I'd like to understand more about our business, in particular about our customers. Where do we fly to, and is our model low cost or full service?
Good questions. We're a full-service airline. Also, we operate intra-European flights and long-haul ones to Latin America and Africa.
Thank you for that. Before I lay down a structure, I'd like to ensure that I'm tackling the right problem. The CEO intends for us to help her get back to profitability. Is this correct? Or are there any other goals I should be aware of?
No, getting back to profitability is the only goal.
Do we have any time horizon for this, and any specific quantitative goal?
As with most clients, they need to get there as fast as possible.
Sure, I'll get to work then.
Now, let's analyze our candidate's approach so far. First, the candidate started by expressing interest in the problem. After that, they introduced their intended approach in a top-down way, clearly laying out the key areas of investigation. Whilst many candidates tend to ask an unstructured barrage of questions, our candidate focused on understanding the key aspects of how the company makes money. You can learn more about the questions you should ask before starting a case in the Identify the Problem video of our Case Academy. Once understood the business model, the candidate clarified the problem, laying down a hypothesis about what the goal is, and checking if there were any quantitative metrics associated with that goal. In general, the candidate opened the interview by demonstrating that they were goal-oriented and structured in their approach, a good first impression. Now we move on to step 2, building a structure tailored to the problem at hand. How would you structure the problem? Pause the video and take a moment to think it through. The candidate begins to draw their own structure.
They note, if profits have been declining, it must be the case that revenues have decreased or costs have increased or both. If revenues declined, Either the number of our passengers has gone down or the average revenue per passenger has decreased. In the first case, we can break down the number of passengers into the product of the number of flights, the aircraft capacity, and its occupancy. In the case of revenue per passenger, I'd break that down into ticket revenue and other revenue sources such as food, luggage, and others. On the other hand, if costs have increased, it must be the case that either fixed cost increased, such as marketing and SG&A, or variable cost increased. In the second case, we can again break this down into volume and unit cost as measured in cost per flight or per passenger. Does this structure make sense to you? If so, I can get started on analyzing the problem and refining it further.
Yes, this sounds good.
Let's take a look at how well the candidate did from two perspectives. First, how well have they developed their structure? And second, how well have they presented that structure to the interviewer? In terms of the structure itself, let's take a walkthrough looking at the key features of this structure. To begin, at each level of the structure, all branches are MCC, implying that they do not overlap, and that taken together, they represent the whole set of issues to be considered. Since we used a mathematical segmentation approach, MCCness is ensured, as we explain in our Build Your Problem-Driven Structure video from the My Consulting Coach Case Academy. Different drivers are used to determine breakdowns depending upon the specific situation. As such, our candidate switches between breakdowns of revenue sources and of other factors driving the number of passengers. Since each level is made up of drivers of the previous one, there is no crossover between the levels of different branches. Each of the end nodes is material and actionable. This means that the company can act upon all these issues with different initiatives. Finally, the structure has two main branches connecting to 7 easy-to-understand end nodes in an intuitive way. As such, it is actually simple enough to be useful. Now we can look at how the candidate presented their structure. Here, that presentation made use of 2 key principles. First, the candidate communicated their structure in a top-down way, proceeding level by level. Second, they showed how the structure is relevant to the case and focuses on drivers that can be acted upon, demonstrating actionability. In general, then, we can see that the candidate built an appropriate structure that proved to be MCC, level consistent, actionable, material, and simple. The candidate then communicated that structure in a top-down way, showing how each node connected to the overall governing thought. Now that we have a solid structure in place, let's move on to the third step of solving a case, leading the analysis. That is going from structure to recommendations. The interviewer guides the candidate as to where to start.
Very good. Our client asked us to look into costs first, as they feel this is an area where they can improve. They gave us information about the variable cost structure. Where would you like to start in terms of looking for cost savings?
The interviewer then presents the candidate with this graph showing the fraction of total cost accounted for by various aspects of the business. How would you proceed from here? Consider what you would do next before we hear from our candidate. The candidate begins their analysis.
From this data, we can tell all cost items are rising above inflation, which is unsustainable. Thus, though I agree with the client regarding the need to find cost savings, we must also find a way of making sure this rise in cost stops. To prioritize my approach, I would also be interested in knowing the relative size of the pie, so I can infer which costs contribute most to the overall rise in costs.
Excellent question. We got this information back.
The candidate proceeds.
Perfect. With this information, I can quickly multiply the 2 columns and obtain the relative contributions of each factor. I won't bother with the last 2 items as they account for a relatively small percentage.
With these numbers in hand, the candidate decides what to do next and makes some further inquiries.
Based on this information, I'd like to prioritize looking into staff cost and fuel, as they account for the biggest shares of cost. Before proceeding, I'd like to clarify if we are able to influence fuel cost. Since it is a commodity, it might be outside of our control and thus not worth our time.
How would you check if we are able to influence them or not?
Well, we can check if different airlines display lower cost of fuel per kilometer or per flight than us. If so, there must be something we can do about it.
Good point. We actually have some of the highest fuel costs per kilometer.
In that case, I'd like to look into them first and then into our staff cost.
Let's analyze our candidates' analysis so far. As you can see, in an interviewer-led case, interviewer questions will move you through the case. The interviewer will start to lead the analysis for us, putting down a hypothesis about which branch of our structure we should look into first. In this case, the candidate has been instructed to examine costs first. In terms of how the candidate has dealt with the case, they quickly extracted the "so what" from the initial graph. Whether we receive any data, we should always review and synthesize it to extract the "so what" in this manner, as we discuss in the consulting thinking video of our Case Academy. When they asked for the size of the pie, they showed they were thinking in terms of prioritization criteria. Knowing the actual value of each cost driver as well as their growth rate, we get a clear idea of which elements of cost have the most impact on the company's finances. The candidate is also exhibiting 80-20 thinking, as they are trying to narrow their analysis down to a few factors which drive the majority of the cost increase. The candidate ran the numbers efficiently, using differential thinking, that is, multiplying shares and growth rates instead of figuring out absolute values. You can learn more about efficient calculation in the consulting maths and differential thinking videos from our Case Academy. After completing their calculations, the candidate identified the biggest cost buckets and prioritized them, as they were probably the ones with the highest potential for impact. However, the prioritization exercise did not stop here. Our candidate also ensured that they were deep diving on items the airline had effectively controlled upon. This approach can help in optimizing time allocation in a case. Now let's return to the case. The interviewer prompts the candidate.
Very well. How shall we lower these guys' fuel costs then?
How would you approach lowering Caledonia Airways' fuel costs? If you need to, it's okay to ask for 20 seconds here to structure your thoughts. Whilst doing so, try to remember what we have learned about case solving. Most importantly, always think back to the original problem, as whatever we do must actually be relevant to solving it. Remember that you might not strike on the correct solution straight out of the gate. Whatever your initial hypothesis, you must be prepared to build out your structure to follow it through, but then iterate and start again, possibly from an entirely new structure if it doesn't work out. Also, note that these principles are equally valid in both interviewer-led and candidate-led cases. Now it's time to see how our candidate tackled the fuel cost issue.
Very well. We can break down fuel costs down into kilometer and price per kilometer. We can break down the price per kilometer further into fuel price per liter and liters per kilometers. In other words, fuel efficiency. You told me we had higher cost per kilometer than our competitors, so I'll focus on that branch. My hypothesis is that the price per liter are the same across companies. It's a commodity. And so the difference comes from the fuel efficiency, liters per kilometer. Is this correct?
Yes, this is true. There are some differences in price per kilometer, but the bulk of the difference comes from fuel efficiency. So what?
In this case, I'd like to explore how we can improve our fuel efficiency. I see three main options. We can fly more fuel-efficient routes, we can get more fuel-efficient planes, or we can operate them in a more fuel-efficient way. On the first point, we can revise the routes we fly to optimize for stopovers and other factors, though this is likely connected to the company's overall strategy and a broader discussion would be required. On the second, we can buy more fuel-efficient planes or upgrade our engines. Lastly, we can benchmark more efficient competitors and understand their best practices, such as charging for overweight luggage. I think this last point is most likely to have a positive impact.
The interviewer provides some additional information and steers the analysis.
Very well. The route plan is fixed and our client is actually cash constrained, so they cannot renew their fleet. However, there are definitely operational improvements they can look for. According to experts, we might be able to save 10% of our fuel cost in this manner.
Our candidate responds,
Perfect. This would equate to around 4% of the total cost structure, given fuel costs account for 40%.
Now let's pause again to analyze how the candidate is doing. Again, the candidate continues to develop their structure as they address new issues. That is to say, they iterate between leading the analysis and structuring the problem. The candidate continues to follow the same mathematical approach to segmentation, ensuring messiness. They prioritize based on the root cause analysis, trying to get to the bottom of the differences as compared to competitors. They also set out a hypothesis related to control, noting that commodity prices are normally not controllable. Overall, the candidate relentlessly prioritizes to ensure time efficiency. You can learn more about how to analyze a case efficiently in the Lead the Analysis video in our Academy. The candidate has moved into solution generation mode. This means attacking the problem in a way which is structured. Rather than just rattling off a laundry list of ideas, the candidate set out 3 buckets and then further broke these down. Tailored. All the ideas are very specific to the context of the problem. Actionable. The candidate anticipated the feasibility of their ideas. Once the interviewer was aligned on the 3 buckets, they broke down each bucket into clear ideas, which they then prioritized based on actionability and ease of implementation. Returning to the analysis then, the interviewer adds the following.
Moving on to staff costs, the CEO believes that they could save a lot if they replaced 80% of the older pilots with younger ones in the next 4 months. She wants our view on this. What do you think?
Can I have 30 seconds to think?
Well, if you can figure it out in 30 seconds, that'll be really impressive.
Now, consider how you would approach this issue. If you need to, it's fine to take a few seconds to structure your thoughts, like our candidate has asked for. After a brief pause, then our candidate states,
I'd want to consider 3 elements. First, what is the financial impact of this program? Second, its qualitative impacts. Finally, its feasibility. Can we actually train young pilots quickly enough to replace these older pilots? And can we do this legally? In terms of the qualitative impacts, I'd break them down on the different stakeholders we have. How will clients perceive this in terms of quality and safety impacts? How will the rest of the staff react? And how will our culture change? Finally, some of the other stakeholders might warrant consideration as well, government, media, etc.
The interviewer responds, providing the candidate with some new information.
Very good. We're short on time, so let's be efficient. They've looked at all the qualitative concerns they might have, and they're comfortable this will not have a big effect on our quality, reputation, or staff morale. They also have their own pilot academy they can use, so they can train enough pilots quickly. So that leaves us with the final impact. Are you ready for some numbers?
Always.
Excellent. So the good news is we expect to be able to save 24% of our staff costs per annum from now on after implementing this program. The bad news is we'll probably face some disruption, strikes, lack of pilots, etc., during the 4 months in which we implement this program. This will likely lead to the cancellation of around 25% of our flights during that period. Also, we'll have a one-off charge of $10 million for early retirement packages, court fees, etc. Our client wants to know what the impact is in year 1. Unless the program pays back within 1 year, our client is not interested.
That was a lot of information. Let me make sure I got all that. First, we'll have an upside of saving 24% of our staff cost in perpetuity. Second, we'll have to cancel 25% of our flights in the next 4 months. And third, we'll have a one-off charge of $10 million. Is this right?
Yes.
Perfect. I'll just take a moment to set up my calculations then.
Our candidate then makes the calculations we see here, determining the impact as three components. First, our savings, which will be 24% of staff costs, which themselves are 40% of our total cost. Second, losses from canceled flights, which will affect us in 4 out of 12 months and will jeopardize 25% of our revenues. Finally, the $10 million charge. Do you agree with this? However, the interviewer points out there might be a problem.
I think you might be missing something there. What's happening on the second point?
The candidate tries to figure out the issue. The flights are being canceled, so we lose the associated revenue. Is there anything else?
Well, if the planes are not flying...
Oh, right. We won't have variable costs like fuel either.
Bingo. Very well. Get started.
The candidate thus modifies their calculations as shown so as to take account of reduced variable costs. The analysis moves on. Well, I'd need information about our revenues and about our variable costs.
Revenues are 10% below our cost these days. Total costs are $267 million. 50% of them are variable.
Perfect. In that case, I can rewrite point 2 as loss from canceled flights equals 4 over 12 times 25% times 0.9 of cost minus 0.5 of cost. So I'll run through the calculations now. Would it be okay if I did some rounding?
Go for it.
I will start from point 1. Savings equal 24% times 40% times total cost, with this approximately equal to 25% times 40% times total cost, equaling 10% times total cost. This equals 10% times 267, which is approximately equal to 10% times 270, equaling $27 million. Then moving on to point 2. Loss from canceled flight equals 4 over 12 times 25% times 0.9 of cost minus 0.5 of cost. This equals 1/3 times 25% times 0.4 of cost, which is approximately equal to 1/3 times 270 times 10%, which equals 90 times 10%, equating to $9 million. Finally, point 3 is just $10 million, so adding everything up, impact on year 1 equals savings minus losses from canceled flights minus one-off losses, equaling 27 minus 9 minus 10, which equals 17 minus 9, giving a final answer of $8 million. This is, of course, the value for the first year. For the following years, assuming the strike and the charge were one-offs, we'll be saving $27 million per year, or 10% of our total cost. Since our revenue is 10% below our cost today, this initiative will basically allow us to break even. Together with the fuel savings, we should return to profitability.
Very good.
Now let's see how our candidate has done with their analysis. The crucial thing to note is that the candidate took the time to structure their thoughts. This is half the battle. Most candidates just start rambling about the first thought that pops into their head. If we wanted to nitpick, we could argue that the structure is not 100% MCC, as it does not cover all qualitative factors. Nevertheless, it covers the most important ground, and from an 80-20 perspective, it is more than sufficient. It is okay to not be completely exhaustive in considering qualitative factors for intermediate questions along the case. As they have done throughout, the candidate continued to communicate their approach in a top-down manner. Again, they recapped key information about the case to make sure they got everything. In terms of the mathematics, the most important thing the candidate did was to set up their calculations before starting them. This is a key factor that will differentiate them from unsuccessful candidates. Setting up calculations in advance makes it easier to correct mistakes, keep track of the process, and to make sure that the signs of operations are correct. Crucially, our candidate remembered to check with the interviewer before proceeding to perform calculations, effectively avoiding a mistake and coming up as an easy-to-coach prospective consultant. Bear in mind that it is almost certain that you will make some kind of mistake during the case. How you spot and come back from such a mistake is key. To do so, it is always important to listen to the interviewer's cues, which the candidate did here. Explicitly laying down the calculations to be made before starting made it much easier to adjust the flawed part. If the candidate had dived straight into calculations, they would have had to start the whole process from scratch, wasting valuable time in a manner which is obviously far from efficient. Only after checking the calculations to be made does the candidate ask for the remaining pieces of information they do not yet have. The candidate checks that they are permitted to make some roundings, again saving on time. The calculations weren't particularly tough, but let's have a look at some of the simplifications the candidate used to make things as quick and error-free as possible. The candidate was diligent in making useful and sensible roundings wherever possible. They made calculations easier by simplifying ratios before computing final values. Generally, the candidate looked for easy-to-perform operations and reordered calculations so as to make these possible. Finally, they kept track of their units and always presented answers in terms of them. As with any good analysis, the candidate walks through the implications of the numbers instead of just spitting out the numerical result. Specifically, the candidate addresses the client's question and how their analysis ties to the original problem. We've gone over a lot here. We should pause and reflect on the key points again. We should be ready to go back into structure mode whenever a new question is introduced. In leading the analysis, we should apply prioritization and hypothesis-driven principles. We should set up calculations before diving into them. To learn more about these principles, please visit the Lead the Analysis video from our Academy. Now we are finally ready to go for the last of our 4 steps, providing recommendations. The interviewer prompts the candidate.
Good work on those numbers. Let's say that you just finished running them. The CEO of our client walked into the room and asked us for an update. What do you tell them?
Can I have some time to gather my thoughts?
Sure, but better be fast. CEOs tend to be impatient.
Okay, it'll be 20 seconds.
With 20 seconds to prepare, how would you provide recommendations? Interested? Watch the full video and many more in the My Consulting Coach Academy, our end-to-end case and fit interview course, and learn to tackle problems in the same way real consultants do. Now, you may wonder, what is so special about the My Consulting Coach Academy? First, the idea behind it. 20 top ex-consultants from McKinsey, BCG, and Bain developed this course to set a new standard. We teach you to build tailored solutions to case problems rather than force-fitting some ready-made frameworks. Second, the breadth. We cover all topics related to the consulting interview, leaving nothing off the checklist. Required fundamentals, systematic case cracking, quick calculation tools, fit interview stories, and much more. We've got you covered. And finally, the active learning. We created more than 200 exercises to test your skills in the most critical areas of case interviews, including structure building, critical reasoning, analytical problems, and full cases.